I guess taking a couple weeks off will contribute to low attendance, but it matters not. Pretty much what we're going to be doing today is we're just going to press through it. This is usually the lesson that most people like most. Well, not like most, people are most interested in this subject, persecution. You know, you hear about how the Roman Empire really severely persecuted and tortured the church. That's what we're going to cover. And so if you look back on the title, I'm covering a good chunk of years. The year roughly 100 all the way to 325. I'm taking it all at once. We're just going to cover persecution as a subject. We're going to hit it for a couple hundred years. And yep, that's how we roll. So pretty much getting started on this, this lesson kind of just letting you know where it's going. We're going to talk about persecution from the beginning of the church up through the 4th century when persecution formally ended. But I do want you to know, and this kind of will tell you how I'm going to be doing the next couple lessons, is that there were both external and internal threats to the church during this time. And so external threats, think about it. What does external mean? It comes from the outside. What does internal mean? Comes from the inside. So external threats are persecution. That's unbelievers trying to destroy the church from the outside. Internal threats are like heresies, the heretics, the Gnostics, all that kind of stuff, the people who were pushing anti-Trinitarianism, whatever it might be, right? So what I want to do is I want to cover the external threats all in one lesson, just cover all of the years of it, leading up to the legalization of Christianity. And then we'll go back and start over and we'll cover the internal threats. Then we'll go back again and cover pretty much the major church writings in that time, the apologists, you know, and stuff like that. And then by the time we're done with that, we'll do our next snapshot lesson. So pretty much 3 lessons that are going to cover this same set of years, roughly 100 to 325. And, you know, sometimes the reason I'm doing it this way is sometimes it's just better history to take a subject throughout the years rather than just say, hey, we're going to go through the years and try to talk about everything. I mean, if I was talking about persecution and then church fathers and then heresies all in the same 50-year period, you might kind of get confused. So let's just hit the persecution all together. Then let's hit the heresies all together, and then let's hit the church fathers and their writings all together. And so, so pretty much that's where I'm going with this. Persecution is going to be discussed as follows, right? There's going to be, first, the way I'm going to deal with this in this lesson is I'm going to talk about why the church was persecuted. In fact, that's going to be the single biggest subject. Before we even get to the persecution, I want you to know why. Then we're going to talk about the different kinds of persecution. That'll be really fast. And then we're going to do an emperor by emperor discussion of the major persecutions. That way you'll know who the key persecutors were. And it's also helpful to know that not all persecution's the same, and it's not even the same from century to century. So 1st century, it was very sporadic, okay? Like you hear of what Emperor Nero did, and you probably have this picture in your head that everywhere in the Roman Empire, Christians were being hunted down. That just wasn't the case. That was in Rome, and it was sporadic. In the rest of the empire, nobody cared. Same thing with Domitian. It's going to be Rome, and it's going to be Asia Minor, and I'll talk a little bit about that. When you get to the 2nd century, now they get more organized, but they're still not happening everywhere. When you get to the 3rd century and 4th century, now they're universal. They're happening everywhere in the empire. And so I guess what I'm saying is the later we get in the Roman era, the worse it gets, okay? And so early on, even though it seems like things were bad in the days of the apostles, they're going to get a lot worse. Okay? And there's a lot of lessons we could learn today because I do think we are able to see that, like we could read the writing on the wall. We see a storm's coming, right? Our culture hates everything that Christianity's about. It's just, it's that simple. And as you guys know, 2 days ago, a Christian school was shot up by a transgender activist. It's, in my opinion, clear that it was motivated based on anti-Christian animus, and there's certain media outlets already presenting the shooter as a victim. Oh, this trans person was rejected by Christian parents. Really? What about the 3 kids who are dead? You know? But that's what they're going to focus on. And so that kind of lets you know where things are going. You know, and there's going to be some parallels from now to back then. So let me start first with the big question that's going to take some time to get through. Why persecution? Okay? Why did people hate the church? Why was the church hunted down systematically at some points? And there's a lot of reasons, okay? And so keeping it real simple to begin with, the Romans had two classifications for religion. They had religio licita and religio illicita. Now, what do you think that means? Yeah, legit or illegit, or legal and illegal, right? A lot of our words come from Latin, and so that's why sometimes you could sound smart like you know Latin, just because you could figure out, what the words are getting at. So Romans had this classification. It's either a legal religion or an illegal religion. Now, for the most part, if the Romans conquered someone, who they conquered were polytheistic like the Romans. And the Romans would be like, hey, you could still pray to your gods. We'll make it legal as long as you pray to the emperor and as long as you honor the Roman gods. And if you're a polytheist and you believe in a God for everything, a God for wine, a God for the wind, a God for my safe voyage or whatever, then it's not a hard pill for you to swallow. Oh, I got to worship the Roman gods too? Okay. And I got to, make an offering to the emperor? I could do that. And so paganism was paganism. And most paganism was legal. Okay? Anybody that wouldn't go along with paganism, it was illegal, except for one exception, the Jews. For some reason, the Romans, they figured that if we don't let the Jews have their way, it's going to be revolt after revolt, and we're going to have to send troops, armies, and we're going to be fighting them until we eradicate them. And so it makes more sense to let them worship their one God, not have to worship the emperor, and get them to pay their taxes. We can make money off of them. So if we kill them, we get no money. If we let them have their way on this and they pay their taxes, all is good, okay? And not only that, you have to understand the Romans, even though they were pragmatic, they were religious. And so certain Roman politicians would read the Old Testament and they'd be like, well, you might not want to make their God mad. Look what he did to Egypt. Look what he did to Babylon. And so let them have their way. They're a backward people. We think they're stupid, but as long as they pay their taxes and they're not starting riots, we're good to go. Now, with Christianity, at first they thought it was Judaism. I mean, Jesus was a Jew. We follow a Jewish Messiah. We worship one God alone. We reject paganism. So at first the Romans are like, oh, this is just another group within Judaism. They already knew there were Pharisees, Sadducees. Okay, so these Nazarenes, they're just another group. And so at first, in the days of the apostles, Christianity was legal. The Romans weren't hunting them down because they're just more Jews. But eventually the Jews start saying, wait, they're not Jews. We don't like them, and we reject them. And there eventually came a point where the Romans realized, okay, hold on, if it's not Judaism, then they have to follow the rules everybody else does. And given the fact that, Christianity spreads, the Jews, for example, they keep to themselves. They didn't want Gentiles to believe. You foolish Romans, one day we'll be on top, right? But when it came to Christians, they're going to everybody and trying to get people to abandon paganism. And the more people that become Christian is the more people who won't bow down to Caesar and won't say Caesar is Lord. So eventually, it takes time, but eventually the empire is like, okay, these Christians are going to be a problem. And they're not Jews. And so they don't get those same exemptions. So they need to worship our gods and they need to honor the emperor. And that is politically and legally when things are going to start to get difficult for Christians. So does that make sense? Hopefully that would. And so that kind of covers those bullets at the bottom. And just to let you know, there are a lot of false rumors going around about Christians. Just like there's false rumors going around about Christians today. I'll share with you what some of those rumors were. Okay, so let's start with those rumors. Okay, these rumors intensified over time due to the fact that Christians met in secret. When a group meets in secret, and they seem to be antisocial already by the standards of the rest of the society, what usually happens? Conspiracy theories start to form. These must be the most rotten people. They're probably doing something awful in their secret meetings. And remember what I told you in a previous lesson, how they would let unbelievers come in for the preaching, but for the prayer and the Lord's Supper, they made all unbelievers leave. So what are they really eating in there? And hence came the rumor that they're cannibals. Because we hear them talk about eating the body, we hear them about drinking blood, we hear them talk about his flesh is true food and his blood is true drink. And so they're thinking, they're eating somebody. Oh my gosh, these people are sick. Okay? So Christians were accused of being cannibals because of misunderstandings of the Lord's Supper. Okay? And then the second big rumor is Christians were extremely immoral. which is weird because Christians wouldn't attend stage plays and all that because there was sexually explicit material. So it seemed clear that they were against sexual immorality. But the society still thought, no, we think there's more to it. They call each other brother and sisters, and they call their feasts love feasts. We know what's going on. It's mass incest. And so they, one, thought they were killing people and eating their flesh and drinking their blood. Two, they thought it was just one massive party of incest. And then three, they thought they were atheists. And you might say, what? They thought Christians were atheists? Well, think about what was normal back then. What was normal is you have a statue for every god that's out there. Now you got a group of people that has no statues. One, they say none of your gods are real, right? None of your gods are real. Okay, smarty pants, what God is real? Our God. Well, what does he look like? Well, we don't worship images. We have no images of him. So they start to think, well, they have no God then. In fact, in the 2nd century, one of the famous cries whenever they would kill Christians was death to the atheists. So could you imagine being a Christian being killed for being an atheist when you're a Christian? But that's pretty much one of the accusations, that they're atheists. They don't believe in any God. Because to the Romans, how could you not have images? It just made no sense to them. Again, they could tolerate it with the Jews, but they won't tolerate it with anybody else. And as soon as they start saying Christians aren't Jews and they see it that way, then if there's no image of the God, then they must be atheists. So that's how they saw them. Now, you got these rumors. These rumors are going around. When I mentioned Nero's persecution, I'll bring it back up again because Tacitus is going to tell us that the Christians were being scapegoated, but he's still going to write about them in a way as if he believes these rumors. Like, these are horrible people, these Christians, but they didn't do what Nero was blaming them for. It's pretty much what he's saying. Why did Tacitus in the in the 60s of the 1st century think Christians were that awful? Because in the early 2nd century when he wrote it, these were the rumors. Now, you're going to have a governor named Pliny. And Pliny is going to start capturing Christians and torturing them to get to the bottom of this. And under torture, people do tell the truth. You know, it's just the way it goes. How do you think we found so many terrorists? Well, that's politically charged. But anyhow, so pretty much when you're torturing people, they'll tell the truth. And after a lot of torture, he's like, you know what? There's nothing going on here. They get up very early in the morning to sing songs to Christ. They worship him as a god. And then they come back later to eat regular food. You know, the Agape Fest is regular food. And they take care of the poor. They do all this kind of stuff. And so all the rumors aren't true. But it's still an illegal religion. What do you want me to do with them? That's what he's asking Emperor Trajan. And Trajan's going to give the answer, and I'll come back to that when we get there. But my point is, these were what society believed, and finally when a government official tortured him to get to the bottom of it, he more or less said, okay, none of this stuff's true. But you know how it is. Think about conspiracy theories today. You know, there's probably some people who still believe in the QAnon stuff, even though it's been debunked, right? Once conspiracy theories start flying out there, people are going to believe them, and unfortunately people get killed from that, and a lot of Christians did back then. Okay, so those were the rumors. Next thing I want to talk about is the social cultural stuff. Roman society was dedicated to its social, cultural, political, moral, and religious norms. And that pretty much covers everything that has to deal with a culture's culture, right? When you're dealing with the social, cultural, political, moral, and religious norms. Christianity was inherently opposed to paganism. And pretty much in Roman society, pagan religion intersected with everything they did. There was nothing that they did that was not inherently religious. And because it was inherently pagan, inherently religious, guess what Christians have to do? They have to refrain. They can't take part in it because then we'd be taking part in idolatry, okay? So pagan religion was present in the empire's institutions and social practices. Case examples like official state occasions. Whenever like a city mayor or whatever would honor a new building, guess what? Let's sacrifice to a particular god and have a big celebration to this particular god that we're given the credit for it. Every Roman holiday was always about their gods. Okay? So it's, you know, think about it. We celebrate the 4th of July. We have fireworks. It's okay. There's nothing about it that makes us feel like we're committing idolatry. But what if the 4th of July inherently every single time had food sacrificed to, like, I don't know, Buddha? Let's just throw something out there. And then everybody's doing all these Buddhist rituals. Would we take part in the 4th of July celebration? No, we would refrain. Almost everything in Rome, especially their holidays, was religiously charged. There was always worship to the gods. Public entertainment. Okay, well, I want to go to the theater or whatever. Well, with public entertainment, the circus and the theater, there's always a sacrifice and worship to the gods. So you might want to see a race on chariots, but they're going to make a sacrifice to the gods, do all this prayer, all this worshiping first. So now you're thinking, I can't take part in that. Stage plays. What was the most common thing that they would make plays about? It was their gods. And then they would always throw sex scenes in it. And you might say, well, wait a minute, we understand how that works in movies. They would do that stuff on the stage. Okay? They just would. And so Christians could not go to that. So the church shunned these things, but these were the things that were the normal part of Roman society. So if one group's saying this stuff's all evil, we want no part of it, everybody else is going to feel like, well, what are you saying about us then? You saying we're bad people? You're saying the things we like are bad? You're saying our culture's wrong? You kind of get where it's coming from, like where they're coming from and why they're going to hate Christians. And then even hospitals, you get sick. Look, the standard of care wasn't that great back then. They didn't have the medical knowledge we have today, but they still had hospitals, some of them. And guess who the patron god of the hospitals was? Asclepius. And so you go there's going to be sacrifices to this god. So it's like, well, I can't go to the hospital. I mean, pretty much as Christians, you couldn't do anything in that society. I find it so interesting how Christians in our society whine when we say, hey, you probably shouldn't, go to movies that have explicit sex in them. You probably, shouldn't do yoga. Well, how dare you? You legalistic. If that kind of Christian tried to live in the church back then, the church would say, you're not even a Christian if you have that attitude. We're supposed to stay as far away from paganism as we can. What about public schools? Christians wouldn't have any part of it. They did have public schools, but guess what? What did the schools teach? Pagan religion. Oh, the gods blessed the founding of Rome. We worship the goddess Roma, who's the patron goddess of the city of Rome. All that kind of stuff. You want your Christian kids learning that? And think about what we teach our kids in school. We try to teach them to be patriotic. We teach them about George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, the wars that we value, Martin Luther King Jr., all that kind of stuff. Well, imagine if instead in the schools it was, well, it is now, right? What are they doing now? They're pushing explicit, sex education on kindergartners. And why do you think there's a mass Christian exodus out of the schools? We're just doing what the early Christians did. Once the public school system becomes a brainwashing machine for paganism, Christians couldn't be part of it. Once it becomes a brainwashing machine for the LGBTQ revolution, guess what? Christians can't be part of it. It's just, and Marxism. We know that there's social Marxism or cultural Marxism and all that stuff being pushed. What about Christian artists? What about our Davids and Jeffs and all that lived back then? Well, they couldn't really do too many jobs because most people who would pay for a commissioning of art want something that depicts their religion. And so it's like, I can't use my talent to depict Zeus or Jupiter, same God, they synthesized them, conquering Kronos. Well, I just can't do that. And it's the same thing we're seeing today when a cake baker's like, look, I'll make a cake, for a gay person, but I will not make a cake celebrating a gay wedding. I cannot use my artistic ability to celebrate something that I think goes against God's word. It's the same thing in what's happening. They're getting sued for this kind of stuff again and again. It's interesting that there's nothing new under the sun. Okay, they had it harder back then. Okay, I'm not even trying to remotely say, oh, it's just as bad now. What I'm saying is you could see the storm clouds, and it's going to be as bad. We already see the seeds of it. Okay, but that's one aspect there. So of the social cultural stuff, there's more. Okay, pagan families, your neighbor. Let's see if these Christians are all right people. Why don't you come over for dinner? I can't come to your house for dinner, but thank you for the invite. You stuck-up Christian. Now, why couldn't the Christian go over? Because pagan families began every meal with a liquid offering poured out to their gods and then a prayer to the gods. And again, if we're to stay far away from idols, What's going to happen? Christians would not be able to enjoy meals with their neighbors. And then think of the big pagan feasts and celebrations that I already mentioned. They were usually in pagan temples. Paul made it clear in 1 Corinthians 10, you are not to go into those temples and eat food sacrificed to idols. And Jesus in the letters to the 7 churches in Revelation threatens to destroy a couple churches because they're eating food sacrificed to idols. And Paul in 1 Corinthians 8 says, look, we know those gods aren't real. We know there's only one God and one Lord, Jesus. But then in chapter 10, he says, but if you go to those temples, you're partnering with demons, because behind those gods that don't exist are demons that do exist. That's why you can't take part in idolatry. That's why you can't, even if you walk into the temple of Zeus and say, I know Zeus isn't real, but that steak's real. That's the only reason I'm here. You know, that's how we would think today. But Paul's saying, no, you're partnering with demons. Go buy steak in the market and don't ask if it was sacrificed to idols. Then you can have your steak, but don't go into that temple, right? And so Christians followed what the apostles taught. And even tradesmen guilds. So let's say you're a metalsmith or whatever. Well, there's a metalsmith guild in your city. And guess what? That guild has a patron god. And every year, or every couple months even maybe, there might be a sacrifice to that god. And everybody who does that trade in the city is supposed to show up, give their contribution, pay their dues, and whatever. If you don't show up, then the guild might say, you cannot do your trade in our city. So now you lost your ability to make money. Now, this is why Christians were impoverished, okay? Persecution is physical, it's social ostracization, and it's economic. It's economic. You cannot have a job in our city doing metal work because you won't go to our guild meeting. And so the only way that metal worker makes money is little odd jobs for Christians under the table, but it ends up being illegal. So you're between a rock and a hard place. Now, today, there are certain, like in Canada, for example, their medical association is even saying, you know, potential doctors, people who want to be doctors who are not willing to support abortion should not even be allowed in a medical school. So they're already setting the stage in some places to where you cannot be part of these professions as long as you hold to your faith. That's where we're going. That's where it's headed. They were already there. Okay, they were already there. And so military, politics, education were also off limits because they involved pagan religion. For example, you couldn't join the army in most cases because they made constant sacrifices to Rome's gods. And then magistrates, you know, when they would have little city events or whatever, there'd be worship of gods. It was in everything they did. You can't be a teacher. Why can't you be a teacher? Because you were required to make them read the Iliad. And and keep in mind, we read the Iliad today as literature. You know, like, oh, that's a pretty cool story Homer wrote. They believed it. They believed it was real and it was an act of worship for them. That's what makes it different, okay? In their case. And so the teachers are like, well, I can't be in a profession where I'm teaching kids paganism and trying to pass this on. And I think it's going to become harder and harder for people to be teachers in our society when they have to push, you know, woke and I know people throw that word around for everything, but there are problematic things being taught in the schools. There just are. And you have to be agents of this new sexual revolution. No, I mean, I'm glad I got out of teaching when I did a couple years ago. I had 15 years in. I don't know if it would have been possible for me to make it another 15 years at the rate things are going. I mean, depending on the district you work in, they might not push this stuff, but eventually it's going to be everywhere. And you can't be a teacher unless you know, kiss the ring. And that's where things are going. Now, I do want to note that there were Christians who did join the army and found a way to somehow always get out of the worshiping the gods. Oh, I got to go clean this toilet or whatever it might be. So they kept their conscience clear, and they took advantage of the government, sending them all over the world on the government dime to make disciples. In fact, a very famous Christian named Pachomius was converted by soldiers. So we know there were Christians that were soldiers. Now, you had early church leaders like Tertullian in the 2nd century saying no Christian can be a soldier. John the Baptist didn't seem to have a problem with that. You know, he just told the soldiers not to extort people. So some Christians became soldiers and they avoided the paganism. And, you know, and some folks would be like, yeah, but soldiers are in a position to kill others. Well, here's the thing. In the Roman army, you had not all soldiers were frontline fighters. Some of them were police, some of them were firefighters. And think about the military today. We have MPs and we have military firefighters. Now, I don't know if they are able to hold a candle to, the civilian folks to where that's all they do, right? But the Roman society didn't have like civilian firefighters and civilian police. It was the military that provided those things, because the military was keeping. The Romans were conquerors. So when you conquer people, how do you keep them under control? With the military presence. Well, that military presence also provides first responder duties. So you could be a soldier and be like, hey, I'm going to be part of the fire brigade. And then you go your whole life never having to kill anybody. You get a full career in. You find a way to get sick every time they're going to make a sacrifice to the gods. And you're preaching the gospel wherever you go. So there were plenty of soldiers that did that. There was debate within the early church as to whether or not you could be a soldier. Some didn't care about the debate. They just did it, and they did it well. Now, pagans also would increasingly blame and attack Christians for any local calamity and disaster. In paganism, if you don't get the rain, it's because the god of rain is mad at you, or the god of wine, or whatever it might be. If an earthquake happens, the god of the land is mad at you. You get what I'm saying? They would constantly pray and sacrifice to these gods for every little thing. So what happens if a famine comes? What happens if an earthquake hits? What happens if a volcano goes off? Somebody ticked the gods off. And I bet you I know who it was. It's those stinking Christians. And you want to know why? One, those Christians dishonor our gods by saying that they're not real. And if there's only 5 or 10 Christians, who cares? But these Christians are going door to door. And they're converting people who once worshipped the god of the volcano, okay, whatever it might be, the gods of the mountains. They convinced them to stop worshiping them. So now that god's ticked off because there's like 10,000 people in this city who used to worship him who don't, and so he blew it up by having a volcano go off. And so Christians were the first ones to get blamed when there were natural disasters, okay? That was a big thing. And then, of course, the Romans definitely prided themselves on their sports, like gladiatorial combat. Well, we're not going to go and watch people kill each other as we're cheering on. Hey, if they just boxed, that's one thing. But this doesn't end in a knockout. Okay, this ends in somebody being killed in front of thousands and thousands of people. So yeah, can't participate in Roman sports. So imagine. You know how we all think Jehovah's Witnesses are weird? At least when I was a little kid. I'm like, okay, they don't have birthdays. They don't watch the Super Bowl. What's wrong with them? I don't even like football, but I watched the Super Bowl when I was a kid. Everybody watched the Super Bowl. It's all about the wings and the nachos and, whatever team you like that day, hoping that they win. Well, here's the thing. Just like I thought somebody who wouldn't watch the Super Bowl was a weirdo back then, they would think somebody who wouldn't go to the gladiatorial combats was a weirdo. And by the way, this is not in any way commending Jehovah's Witnessism. They're legalistic, and they're telling you to stay away from things that aren't wrong. Super Bowl is fine. Gladiatorial combat's not fine, okay? And so pretty much, but the way that we would look at certain people is kind of how they were looking at the Christians. And then Romans, here's a really sad thing. They practiced abortion and infanticide regularly. Our society practices abortion regularly, but it still claims it's against infanticide. Even though there's some people in the Democratic Party in New York, like one of their governors, or it was a mayor, was making the statement a few years back that if a baby was born, like in a botched abortion, but the baby comes out alive, it's still up to the mother whether or not to terminate that baby. And that's infanticide at that point, okay? Well, the Romans, they didn't even make a distinction. Abortion, infanticide, they did both regularly. Unwanted babies, a lot of times girls, or deformed babies, were just left out in the elements to starve to death or be eaten by animals. Usually they were put in dumps because in trash heaps, that's where scavenger animals will show up, and they would just eat them alive. That's what they did. That was their normal barbaric practice. They thought only the strong survive. This deformed baby doesn't deserve to live, or this girl doesn't deserve to live, or whatever it might be. Christians would go into those dumps and they would grab those babies before they would get killed a lot of times, and they would adopt them. It was illegal. You could get killed if you were caught saving one of those babies. But Christians would do that. That's social justice, okay? Social justice isn't necessarily about taking from those who have and giving to those who don't, unless you got a real good reason to do it. But that's social justice. going and adopting these babies and being a part of the solution to the problem. And so Christians would do that. The Romans also culturally practiced easy divorce. Tertullian made the comment that women got married only for the purpose of later divorcing. And they would divorce just because they wake up one day unhappy. So Tertullian was blaming the women. You know, they're the divorce happy ones. Either way, it was a culture where people divorced and remarried all the time. Jesus' teaching was very radical. That, you know, unless it's adultery, you know, or as Paul said, unless an unbeliever abandons a believer, a divorce for any other reason, if you remarry, you're in a state of adultery. Yeah, so pretty much you had that. And then when it came to the way they treated slaves, Romans did not recognize the marriages of slaves. Slaves would be married, and maybe some Christians would marry some slaves that were Christians, but then the owners would be like, no, slaves can't marry. And so the owners would do all sorts of evil things to the women. They would sell them, separate families. Any kids that were born belonged to the master. They'd be sold and separated. And so slaves were treated badly. I know people try to say American slavery was worse, and it was, but Roman slavery wasn't a good thing. It just wasn't. Now, Christians, they weren't calling for the abolition of slavery, but they were calling for humane treatment of the slaves. They were calling for equality of slaves and to recognize their marriages. And even when masters wouldn't, like let's say you have a wife that's about to be sold, Christians would pool their money together if they had enough to buy the freedom of that slave couple so that that marriage wouldn't be broken up. Again, that's social justice. That's what it looks like when it's done right. And so you'd have that going on. And the interesting thing was, even though the church still understood that, hey, slavery is a thing, it's even mentioned in the Bible, they said in the church, slaves and masters are equal. So if you have a master that, is in sin and the church is doing the Matthew 18 process, a slave could vote to excommunicate. Sorry, boss, but you're an adulterer, excommunicate. And that slave's vote, it's just as much as anybody else's. And so stuff like that was radical in the Roman world. They just couldn't understand like what kind of people would think this way. So I want you to think about everything that has been said so far. Okay? Christians rejected just about every aspect of Roman life. I mean, literally everything. Everything that culture did, Christians thought was wrong. We can't participate. Okay? Now, they weren't going around being like culture warriors about it. They weren't going around being loud and obnoxious and acting like Christians on Twitter do today. They weren't doing that at all. But the simple fact of them refraining was offensive. We can't come to your celebrations. We can't come to this. I can't come to your house for dinner. And so they thought the Christians were self-righteous, stuck up, snobs. They just thought they were, there's no way to get around it. If you reject every aspect of a pagan culture, which they had to do, that pagan culture is going to think what? You think you're better than us? You think you could judge us? And that's where a lot of the persecution is going to come from. And keep in mind, staying home for the Roman holidays and not worshiping the Caesar was not only seen as religious failure, but it was unpatriotic. Kind of like they would see that like some people here might see flag burning. That's how they looked at it. Right? So just keep that in mind. There's a reason why these people were so fanatic in killing Christians. Now, that gives you the why. Now, next I said I was going to mention the types of persecution. There's really only 3 types that I'm going to mention. So I covered it all on one slide. Not all persecution was government-sponsored is my point. Okay? The majority of persecution is angry local mobs. Okay, the governor has nothing to do with it. The Roman emperor has nothing to do with it. But in your city, some pagan priest got everybody riled up against the Christians, and they show up with their pitchforks and torches, and some houses are getting burned down. Okay, and that's what happens in India, that's what happens in Pakistan. Same stuff happens today. Probably the majority of persecution is just local angry mobs. Okay, now the second kind of persecution was by overzealous local governors, guys like Pontius Pilate, right? So think of the Romans would set governors over certain regions. Sometimes the emperors don't care about the Christians. But there might be one governor, not all of them, one governor of one region that realizes that his people in that particular moment are really hating on the Christians. And he knows he could get favor by using the military under his disposal to kill Christians. That happened a lot. It wasn't empire-wide, but if you happen to be in a region where the governor has it out for you, you know, you're going to die, you know, a lot of times. And a lot of Christians died in these 3 centuries this way, from more local persecutions that were government, but it wasn't empire-wide. And then finally, you have emperor-led persecutions. This is what we think about. Okay, you might not have even thought about local mobs. You might not have thought about a lone governor that's just wanting to kill Christians. My guess would be aside from local persecutions and governor persecutions than the empire ones. Okay, but what we tend to think of are the empire ones because they're the ones we know the most about. There's more records of them. We know who the emperors were, and it becomes more interesting when you like picture a whole empire, you know, bringing its full weight down against the church. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk mainly about the emperor-led ones because that's what we have information on. I can't tell you about every governor that did something. We don't know, right? I can't tell you about every local uprising. We don't know. But what we do know is what the emperors did. So we're going to go emperor by emperor. But before I do that, I just really quickly want to talk about the days of the apostles. Because the New Testament does record persecution for us. But where did it come from? Okay, when you're reading the New Testament, apart from the book of Revelation, I don't want you picturing the Romans persecuting the church, because they didn't. Okay? The majority of persecution in the first 20 years, 10 to 20 years, came from Jews. Okay, Jews who did not accept the claims of Jesus. So the first Christian martyr, Stephen, where was he killed? Jerusalem. Okay, he was killed by an angry Jewish mob. And whenever Paul would be planting churches in new regions, I got all these verses as references up there, a lot of times the Jews would try to start riots against him to get him run out of town. Okay, so some persecution was just from Jews who did not accept Christianity as a Jewish sect. And then the next level of persecution came from pagan Gentiles. Paul got stoned by pagans in Lystra. You had the pagans in Ephesus fill up the amphitheater. They wanted blood because they thought Paul was causing people to stop worshiping Diana or Artemis, depending on which language. And that's the kind of stuff that's going to happen throughout history. You know, with Paul, you kind of see like a little microcosm of what happens there. And then sometimes the Jews and Gentiles work together, you know, in trying to persecute the church. My point is it wasn't government sanctioned, and there's multiple times where Paul will use the Roman government to protect him. Okay? So you'll get this impression that the Roman government is actually a force for good until you get to Nero, right? But the New Testament doesn't tell us what Nero did. It's only later that we learn about it, okay? And so, pretty much moving on to then Emperor Nero. Now this happens when a lot of the apostles were still alive. But for some reason, not for some reason, most of the books of the New Testament were written before this. That's why it doesn't mention it. Okay? Now by the time you get to Revelation, it's written 30 years after this, but you have the next persecution happening then. So it's not so much going to focus on this. But pretty much with Nero, you've all heard of Emperor Nero. He becomes emperor in 54, and he's reasonable until 62. He was actually a good emperor for 8 years. And then he snapped. He killed his mother. He kicked his pregnant wife to death. He went nuts. Now, his mom had it coming. But, I mean, well, no, we're supposed to honor her. Anyway, she was just as evil as he was. Very, very, very evil. If I remember right, I think, you know, if he didn't kill her, she probably would have killed him type of thing. Because you know how political intrigue works and all that kind of stuff. But what started things with the Christians is in the year 64, a huge fire, July 18th, the year 64, the worst fire in Rome that it ever knew, swept through the city and it destroyed 10 of its 14 districts. So think about how big Rome was, and a lot of people live there. If 10 out of 14 districts get destroyed, that's pretty big. Now, at first, people thought Nero set the fire. And there's all the famous like sayings that he was playing his fiddle while Rome was burning. chances are Nero didn't start the fire. There's historical evidence that it was an oil lamp. And now, I haven't looked at the evidence myself. I just read that in a book. But let's just say it was that. It was a honest-to-goodness accidental fire. But people want to blame somebody. They're already starting not to like Nero at this point. He's trying to tell them, I didn't do it. They're not listening. And so it's convenient for him to blame someone else. Okay? And so what's going to happen is he blamed the Christians. And what he started doing is he rounded up the Christians. He would have them tied on posts, soaked in tar, and then would light them on fire while they're alive. And they lit up the roads, the Roman roads, at night. If you were walking and you had illumination at nighttime, it's because a Christian was being burned alive. He would take them into the amphitheater and have wild skins put on them, or skins of animals, and then have wild beasts just rip them to shreds. He would even have some of them brought into his own backyard and set them on fire, and he would play the fiddle to that. So he was nuts, absolutely nuts. Now, you have the Roman historian Tacitus, who was typical pagan. His life dates are 55 to 117. He'll make it clear when he's writing in the early 2nd century that most people thought Nero set the fire, and that Nero used the Christians as a scapegoat. Now, Tacitus makes it clear that nobody bought it, that nobody thought the Christians actually lit that fire. Okay, but Tacitus, when he's describing them, he says, but they do deserve to die because of their abominations. What do you think he's talking about? Those rumors that started spreading. So anyhow, Nero's persecution, if we're going to put it all together, it shows the following. It shows these following 3 things. 1, Roman authorities by this point started to recognize Christians were distinct from Jews in some respect. At least Nero did. He targeted Christians without killing Jews. Now, a few years later, he's going to be trying to destroy Jews in Jerusalem because of the Jewish revolt. But at this point, he's not rounding up the Jews. Second thing, inhabitants of Rome already had to dislike the Christians because scapegoats have to be a group that are already hated. If you think about it, if you're going to get people riled up to kill people, or at least sit by as you kill people, it has to be a group you already don't like. If it's a group you like, people will protest, right? And so why do you think the Holocaust was even able to happen, in Germany? Because Europe already had 1,000 years of hating Jews. If the group's already hated, you could pull it off. And I say that because if you think about it, as our society is painting us more and more as bad guys, we're the problem. We're the oppressors. We're the ones like, that transgender person shot up that school because her Christian parents wouldn't accept her transgender identity, right? If we're the ones becoming more and more hated, later it makes it easier for them to then go to full-on physical persecution against us. So understand that. Some people try to downplay it. Well, nothing crazy is happening now. That's true. But as you can feel the hatred, and you could feel the society's animus growing against us, that is the first thing that has to happen before you could be scapegoated. What we know is, at least in the city of Rome, that had already happened to the church, to where they could be scapegoated. Now, another thing to mention is persecution was only limited to the city of Rome. This was not empire-wide. This was not something that happened everywhere. This was mainly in Rome and a few surrounding areas. In this persecution, this is where Peter dies. He's crucified upside down, and this is where Paul gets beheaded. So the bottom picture is painting of Peter being crucified upside down. He didn't feel worthy to die in the same way Jesus did, so he said, crucify me upside down. And then Paul, because he was a Roman citizen, they couldn't crucify him, so they had to behead him. Now, I don't know why the artist made his head glow, but they did. And then the top picture just depicts, again, Christians being lit on fire for the amusement of crowds. Now, the next one is Domitian. His life dates are 81 to 96, and in the final year of his reign, he went after the church. This is when John was exiled to the island of Patmos, and this is when he wrote the book of Revelation. So some of the stuff that's being mentioned in the letter to the 7 churches and some of the descriptions throughout Revelation actually have to deal with this persecution. I don't think it's only dealing with that persecution. I think it's dealing with that persecution, the ones that came before, like with Antiochus IV, which I mentioned in the intertestamental stuff. I think he was alluding to Nero. I think he was talking about his own persecution, and I think it's clear he's talking about future persecutions. You know, typology explains it, right? It's the same thing keeps happening again and again until the final one happens. But anyhow, John writes Revelation during this period, so you know persecution was going on. Historians debate the motive, but the typical theory is that, you know, he's a Roman patriot that loves the Roman gods and is really ticked off to see both Jews and Christians not have to worship the Roman gods. So his persecution actually went after Jews as well. Now, the reason he went after the Jews is when the temple stood before Titus destroyed it, Jews paid a temple tax every year. You see Jesus talk about that when that tax is caught out of the fish. He tells Peter to catch the fish. You know, so there's a temple tax. Once the temple was destroyed, the Jews were like, well, we don't have to pay that tax. And Domitian's like, no, yes, you do. Give it to us now. We'll take that money. And the Jews were like, no. And so, okay, I'm going to kill you. So he was going after Jews. But at the same time, there were certain Christians, because of the pagan policies and the emperor worship that was happening in Asia Minor, that stopped paying their taxes. Okay, they felt like what Paul wrote in Romans 13 didn't apply anymore. And so you had Jews not paying a certain tax, Christians not paying a certain tax. And so he's like, you know what? And Christians would not declare Caesar as Lord. Now, Jews were never required to declare Caesar as Lord. But by this point, it was becoming clear to the Roman Empire that Christians and Jews, they're going to see them as different. So there was a statue of Domitian. You had to pour wine out before it once a year and say Caesar is Lord. The Christians were like, we can't, only Christ is Lord. And so because of that, Domitian went after them. Now, this also was not empire-wide. It mainly happened in Rome and Asia Minor, which is Turkey. Turkey is where John had his ministry. Hence, the 7 churches were on that postal route within Asia Minor. And, you know, in Rome at this time, the city of Rome, they weren't quite worshiping the emperor yet. They're like, well, Domitian's not a god. You know, Nero wasn't a god. But the office of emperor is kind of godly. That's how the people in Rome looked at it. The people in Turkey, Asia Minor, no, they thought he was a god. And he was flattered by that. And it was in that spot that the Christians would not worship him. And so, okay, let the persecution happen there. Now, eventually, in Rome, given enough time, they're going to start to think the emperor is a god. Okay? But at this point, it's not that the whole world thought Domitian was Lord, but there was one part of the empire where they did, and that's where Christians are going to be killed. And what's interesting, you want to know how successful the evangelists were. You have Flavius Clemens and his wife Flavia Domitilla. They were executed. They were the emperor's relatives. So could you imagine, you're the emperor, you hate Christians, and the Christians converted some of your own relatives, and you kill your relatives. That's what he did. So that was nuts. Now, regular Romans didn't like Nero because they thought he was a tyrant at the end of his life. They thought Domitian was a tyrant as well. And so they're happy when he dies, and then the persecution ends and it's not so bad, okay? So the next persecution comes just a couple years later with Emperor Trajan, okay? He takes over a couple years after Domitian, and his persecution's not empire-wide. What he does is he sets the official policy, okay? What's the official policy? And it's going to last for 200 years. Remember how I told you Pliny wrote him and said, okay, I tortured these guys. The rumors aren't true, but what do you want me to do with them? Because Christianity is illegal. And here's what Trajan said. He said, simply put, don't go looking for Christians. There's real criminals we need to be looking for. Now that you confirm that they're not doing these bad things, don't go looking for them. And don't take any anonymous reports. If somebody anonymously says, hey, I got a tip that this guy's a Christian, he says, don't listen. If they're not willing to put their name on paper as an accuser, don't even take it. But if somebody puts their name on, as behind an accusation, you grab that person who's been accused and you ask them to recant. If they recant, or if they're willing to worship the pagan gods, you let them go. If they're not willing to worship the pagan gods, then you kill them. And that was the policy for the next 200 years. Don't go looking for them. Don't take anonymous reports. We don't want to witch hunt. But if there's a credible accusation, give them a chance to be a pagan. If they won't, then you kill them. And that ended up being the policy during that time. Ignatius, remember how I was telling you about Ignatius of Antioch? The guy who thought there was, 3 different offices. He separated bishop from presbyter, that guy. He got killed under Trajan. And again, you could tell that it wasn't an empire-wide persecution because once he got arrested, they had to walk him all the way to Rome practically, but they would let him stop in each city and meet other Christians and write them letters, and they weren't killing those other Christians. It's just it was Ignatius. And then when Ignatius got to Rome, the Roman Christians could have got him off, but he actually wanted to die publicly. For some reason, he thought it would make a bigger impact for the kingdom and he'd be following in Christ's footsteps. So he was killed by wild animals in the Colosseum. Okay, so that's Trajan. The next big persecutor, so look, this is a jump in years. We're jumping from, 117 to 161 for the reign dates. Marcus Aurelius, and I put the picture of the emperor from the movie Gladiator because that's who he was playing. Marcus Aurelius, he was a Stoic philosopher. He's supposed to be one of the greatest emperors in Roman history, the wise Marcus Aurelius, but he was a persecutor. And as far as like the way secular historians would look back, he was pretty wise. Okay, but he was a persecutor. We can't deny that. And he despised Christians. He could not stand Christians. And so pretty much under his rule, many Christians will be killed in Africa, Rome, and Gaul. Anybody know where Gaul is? France. So it wasn't called France yet because it wasn't called France until after a Gothic group much later called the Franks moved in there. But in the Roman times it was called Gaul. Right? So just remember, Gaul equals France before the Frenchies were there. Okay? But anyhow, so large numbers were particularly killed in the year 177 in southern France or southern Gaul by regional authorities. And this is where you have the famous martyrdom of Blandia. Now you might be like, who's Blandia? Oh, I have it, you're covered, Fernando.
Okay.
Yeah. So Blandia was this woman who they tortured her for 3 days and she would not recant. They would burn her with hot tongs, ripping her flesh off. They would have animals attack her. And after 3 days, they're like, she just will not die, first off, and she won't recant. And so then eventually they sent this bull, and this bull just kept throwing her in the air and stabbing her with the horns, and she still wouldn't recant and still wouldn't die. And so eventually they put her to death with the sword. But at the end of the 3-day spectacle, the Romans that wanted to see her dead were so impressed with her faith. Like, I would never die like that. But look what this Christian woman did, a woman. And how much she endured. And so this is where martyrs actually start leading to a lot of conversions. And not that it started with Blandia, but she's an example. When the pagans would look at that and say, I don't even know how to describe that, other than her God must be real to get her to endure all that. So you had that happen under Marcus Aurelius. His problem was he thought Christians were obstinate, stubborn. We'll torture them and rather than save their lives, they're just going to stick to their guns till we kill them. I can't stand it, why can't they just pour out wine to a statue even if they don't believe it? They could just say Caesar's Lord and then walk away. No, he's not, and they would be okay with that. The Romans, they're okay with that, but they're like, these guys are so obstinate. These guys are so obstinate that that pretty much they would just rather die, and that drove him nuts. And Marcus Aurelius was also a superstitious man himself, and so there were invasions, floods, and epidemics that spread during his reign, and he thought, it's probably because the Christians are converting people away from the gods. And so you had Blandina. Another famous martyrdom was Felicitas and her 7 sons. Pretty much they rounded her up and her 7 sons and said, if you actually care for your sons, you will denounce the faith. And she said, I would rather every one of them die, and they would rather die than denounce Christ. And so they threatened the sons, even tortured them, but they all went to their grave holding firm. And then finally they tortured her and killed her as well. And none of them denied the Lord. So again, we haven't been pushed to that point yet, but you hear some of these stories, you're like, man, and so if we really believe, we'll be able to do the same. That's my point. And then Justin Martyr, you've all heard of him. You ever wonder why we call him Justin Martyr? He was Justin the apologist who got himself killed, and henceforth we call him Justin Martyr. So it's the way that works. The next emperor, I'm going to try to go through these fast. I know I started a little late, but let me just keep pressing through. Septimus Severus. His reign dates were 193 to 211. And he desired unity across the Roman Empire, because what happened is a lot of stuff was happening. There was a lot of invasions from the Goths, and all that stuff, a lot of Gothic invasions. And so what he just wants is a sense of unity in the country, and one thing that can unite people is religion. So he began a religion called the religion of Sol Invictus, which means the unconquerable sun. Not like sun is in Son of God, but like the sun in the sky. Like not the moon, but the sun. And so he said, you know what? The most superior God out of all of them is the sun. It's always there. It gives light. It's unconquerable. His birthday was December 25th, Sol Invictus. So, and by the way, Christians were already worshiping, or already celebrating the birth of Christ, some by December 25th. So some people try to say Christians stole December 25th from Sol Invictus. No, there's evidence that Christians by this point already believed that Jesus was born on December 25th. So it may just be coincidental. But the point is, all the empire had to comply. Everybody had to worship Sol Invictus. Yeah, you still had to worship the emperor. You still had to worship the Roman gods. But above all is Sol Invictus. And Christians would not do that. Jews and Christians wouldn't do it. And so he didn't go after them, believe it or not. He went after converts. So what Septimus said is, listen, if you're already a Christian and a Jew, fine, stay stupid. But anybody who converts to either Judaism or Christianity will be killed. And so mainly it was to try to stop them from growing. Eventually they'll go old, they'll die, and with no new converts, that's how you solve it. Well, problem is, a lot of people still converted. Didn't matter how many of them he killed. They would keep converting. And so that's and it was in the year 202 when this happened. And so what's going to happen, though, is even though he's not going after old Christians, he's only going after converts, at the same time you have local persecutions. And in the local persecutions, they were going after both. So longtime Christians do get killed, not by the government, but by old Zeke with the pitchfork, who just hates Christians. It's believed that during his reign, Irenaeus was killed. You might not know who Irenaeus is yet. You will in a couple lessons from now. He's one of the most important church fathers. Origen's father, he's another important church father, Origen. His dad got killed. And then you have the famous martyrdom of Perpetua. Perpetua's martyrdom left such a mark on the church that even 200-300 years later, Augustine is talking about her and how much her story impacted him. Perpetua was from the higher classes. She was a young woman. She loved Jesus. She just had a baby. And she got arrested for being a Christian. And her dad, like the Romans didn't want to kill her, because she's from the higher classes, she's pretty, they respect her parents. Her dad was begging her, pleading with her, just denounce Christ. And then you could go back to worshiping him. Just denounce him. She wouldn't. And so her and I think it was 4 companions ended up getting killed publicly in the amphitheater. And just like Blandina, it took a lot to kill her. She got gored by a bull, still survived. They put her out there to be torn to pieces by the lions. They wouldn't. They actually didn't attack her. And so then she got tortured, beaten, and then eventually there was an animal that attacked her, but she still didn't die. And then finally a sword is what finished her off. And so Perpetua is one of those ladies that they actually wrote like impressive odes to her. The early church was impressed with her and impressed with her sealing her fate with her blood. And I remember when both my kids were born, when you got a baby, it's not that you're so much afraid of who's going to raise the baby. You're obsessed with that little thing, that little bald-headed, child, to where like you couldn't imagine that would be the one time where I think people would be most prone to just deny the faith just so they can enjoy their baby. And then, hey, I'll say I'm sorry later. She didn't do it. She didn't do it. She'd rather die. And so again, very impressive. So with this, there were small persecutions. So this one ends when he dies, of course. And then there's going to be some small persecutions from a few emperors after him, but there's nothing big until 250. 250 is when we start getting the universal persecutions, okay? And when it comes to universal persecution, let me talk about Decius. He didn't reign long, but his reign hurt the church bad. Okay, so 249 to 251. Now, before I talk about him, though, the first half of the 3rd century, remember, 3rd century is not 301 and after, it's the 200s. So from 201 to 250, first half, things were actually pretty good for the Christians. And what I mean is a lot of rich families became Christians. There weren't huge persecutions. This was the first time you start getting Christian buildings. Remember, early Christians worshiped in homes. At this point, they had enough of a period where they weren't being hunted down to where they could like actually build buildings and say, this is where we meet and worship. And it was, okay, this is a recognized Christian building. We take that for granted now. It started then, okay? But before that, it was in homes. Rome, the city of Rome had its first Christian cemetery. Nobody burned it down. And some emperors even had a positive attitude towards Christianity. For example, you had Alexander Severus, who reigned 222 to 235. He employed the famous Christian scholar Julius Africanus to run the Roman library. And Julius Africanus was a brilliant scholar. He even had higher critical skills that you don't start to see until like the 1800s. You know, among scholars, he was able to do some of that stuff back then. So pretty smart guy. Then you have, the same emperor, Alexander Severus, he also had a statue of Jesus and a statue of Abraham next to all of his other pagan statues. So he wasn't a Christian, but he respected Christianity. And so he's like, well, I'm not going to go against him. I want me a little Jesus statue. Pretty sure it didn't look like the Jesus statues we have today. And then a later emperor, Philip the Arab, he was called that because he was from Africa. No, he was Arab. But Philip the Arab, 244 to 249, he also had Christian inclinations, and that some believe he was a Christian. We don't know. He might have just been favorable to it, but didn't put his full weight into it. But bottom line is he got overthrown by his most able general, Decius. So Decius takes over, and he begins the first universal persecution of the church. And pretty much, he thought the church threatened the empire's stability. And here's what really kicked it off. And I mean, there's no other way it was going to happen. But in 247, AD 247, that's when Rome celebrated its 1000th anniversary. Talk about the most patriotic day. Christians refused to celebrate. And this is after having 50 years of peace, roughly, but they wouldn't celebrate because, again, paganism was involved. And so just about everybody who was just getting used to Christians and tolerating them were now like, that's a scumbucket move. So now popular sentiment started to grow because they didn't take part in the celebration. And the church father Origen said after that moment, you were able to start to feel anti-Christian animus everywhere. Now, they didn't sense what was coming, but they were able to tell, okay, people aren't liking us again. This isn't good. And so in 248, so the next year, Goths start invading the empire. And it starts causing a huge strain on the empire. So what are people thinking? Things were going great. We had a 1,000-year celebration to honor the gods, and this really big group didn't honor them, and then the next year we got invaded. You know whose fault that is? The Christians' fault. And Decius is picking up on that, right? And so pretty much he's like, you know what? The church needs to be taken out. It needs to be wiped out. And so what he did is he started by targeting church leaders. The Bishop of Rome was killed. Before they were popes, it was still the Bishop of Rome. He was probably the most prestigious bishop. He was killed. Bishop of Antioch was killed. The Bishop of Jerusalem was killed. The early church had 5 big cities where its bishops were the cream of the crop. 3 of them were killed by this guy. That's pretty huge. Imagine if in evangelicalism a persecution happened, John MacArthur, John Piper, and Voddie Baucham all got killed. That's what we're talking about here. Okay, so they went after the leaders. Cyprian of Carthage, who was also a famous leader, he ran away and hid. He didn't deny the faith, but he fled. Now, some people said, you shouldn't flee. What a coward. But he was saying he was fleeing to preserve Christian documents because Decius was burning Bibles. You know, and so Cyprian was trying to preserve this stuff. So then after this, Decius orders that all members of society have to make a sacrifice to the gods. There's a set day, you have to show up, you have to make a sacrifice to the gods. When you make the sacrifice, we will give you a certificate called a libellus. And then at any point, if somebody asks you to show the libellus, if you can't, you will be killed. But if you can, then it means you at least worshiped our gods, and we don't care anymore, right? He knew Christians would not do this. Real Christians wouldn't. And so a lot of Christians refused to worship the gods. They could not supply that paperwork, and they got killed. Now, because there were 50 years of peace and Christians got comfortable, they were not ready for this. A lot of Christians apostatized. They denied the Lord, made the sacrifice, and got the piece of paper. There were other Christians who were scared and didn't want to die for the faith, but they didn't want to apostatize, so they pulled their money together and they bribed government officials to give them a fake certificate. Okay, and so then when somebody said, hey, did you make your sacrifice? Even though they didn't, it's pretty much they're still denying the Lord in the sense by saying, yeah, it's right here. Remember, Jesus said, if you deny me before men, I'll deny you before the Father and the angels. Even though they didn't make that sacrifice, if somebody's saying, show me your papers, if you show that paper, that's your way of saying, I don't believe in Jesus. Okay, so it wasn't as bad as those who apostatized, but it was still bad. And what I'm telling you is enough people of the church fell away or did something like this to where it damaged the church for times to come. This is what happens when you get comfortable and you're not ready for persecution. That's my point. Okay, and so this persecution's going on. Decius gets killed in battle with the Goths in 251, and so the Christians get a short reprieve. But then a couple years later, he gets replaced by one of his generals, Valerian, who also agrees Christians need to die. And so in 257, he renews the persecution. Same thing, you got to make the sacrifice. You have to be able to show this piece of paper. All Christian meetings were declared illegal. So if Christians gathered for any reason, you could kill them. He tried to have all the church leaders, bishops, presbyters executed, and he killed a lot. He actually got Cyprian of Carthage. So he might have dodged Decius, but he couldn't dodge Valerian, and he got killed. He was the most famous victim. So was Stephen, the bishop of Rome. A lot of regular Christians died for the faith, and then, as I said, a whole bunch of others paid for the fake certificate or made the sacrifice. Now, Valerian ended up getting captured by the Persian emperor, and so he was deposed, and that ended the persecution. So, but what I want to say is, and I'm going to try to, are you guys okay with me going 10 more minutes? Okay. So there's a lot of consequences of the Decian and Valerian persecutions. Okay, it shook the church. When you have a lot of famous leaders get killed, who fills that vacuum, right? That's a big thing. A lot of laypersons got killed. But now you have to deal with three important questions. What was to be done with those who apostatized? And the word they used was lapsed. What do we do with lapsed Christians? But they now want to come back. So let's say, one of us in this room made the sacrifice, but now 10 years later feels really bad. I do believe in Jesus. I was scared. Can I come back? Do we let them back to the church, or are they done forever? What was to be done with those who purchased fake certificates? What they did wasn't as bad. Should the decision be the same for both of them? Should they be let back into the church immediately, or should it be after a time, or should it be never? And then finally, who has the authority to decide? These questions jack up the church. I'm just going to tell you, they mess up the church badly because of the disagreements that are going to happen over them. So this started before Valerian's persecution, but after Decius's. Remember, Cyprian survived Decius. He didn't survive Valerian. But these questions came up in the in-between. And Cyprian said, only after a time of penance. He comes up with the idea of penance. If you don't know where that comes from, that you have to do certain things to make up for it. So he said, after a time of penance, and only bishops can make the decision. Only bishops could decide who could come back in, and there has to be a period of time of penance, okay? But then others said, who are you to decide, Cyprian? You ran away from this persecution in Decius. But there were people called the confessors. They should decide. Now, what's a confessor? A confessor is a person who refused to make the sacrifice and refused to buy a fake certificate and said, you could kill me. And so they got arrested and they got tortured and they were going to be killed, but then the persecution ended before they could get killed. And so they survived, but they didn't sell out. And so they were called confessors. And so some people said only the confessors should get to decide what to do with those who didn't confess, with those who fell away. They should decide who gets to come back in. But Cyprian's like, no, confessors aren't bishops. Okay? And remember what I told you about apostolic succession? That you have to have your hands laid on you by somebody who had their hands laid on them? That was already standard by this point. And so Cyprian was saying that, no, I don't care if they're confessors. I don't care if I ran and hid. Bottom line is I have apostolic succession. They don't. The confessors don't get to make this decision. So the argument got pretty severe. And so pretty much what's going to happen is, as they're arguing about it, some people are going to want a more lenient approach than Cyprian and say, just let them back in, and we don't care if it's the bishops or the confessors. But then most people are going to agree with Cyprian. No, let them back in, but they got to prove themselves. And, probably the bishops should decide. Well, Rome is going to follow what Cyprian of Carthage is saying, but then you're going to have a guy in Rome called Novatian. And Novatian's going to say, no, they should never be allowed back in. There's nothing these guys could do to come back. And again, is that biblical? No. Even if you commit a big sin, if you're alive, you could repent. And Novatian's saying, nope, you can't repent of this. They're doomed. They deserve to go to hell. Whereas the Bishop of Rome, Stephen, was saying, no, if they repent and the bishop believes their repentance through their penance, they can come back. And so Novatian broke away from the church and got a lot of people to follow him. And so Novatianism now became a huge schism, and it became a counter church to what was called the Catholic Church. Not Roman Catholic, but Catholic, which just meant universal. Catholic with a small c. So you have the Novatians and you have the Catholics. And now that leads to more questions. Because the Novatians believed in the Trinity, they believed in all the right doctrines, but they didn't believe the regular church was legitimate anymore. But then the regular church didn't believe they were legitimate because they don't have the apostolic succession, and they broke away. So now you have a new set of questions, right? The new set of questions are like, well, what do we do if somebody came to faith by the Novatians? So let's say it was a Novatian evangelist that talked to Albert, and Albert believed because of him, and Albert got baptized in a Novatian church, but now Albert has come to the Catholic Church, and so did his conversion and his baptism count? Okay, so now that's the big argument, right? And Cyprian said yes. Cyprian said, yes, it counts, but the Bishop of Rome, Stephen, said no, it doesn't, or no, hold on. Let me rephrase that. Do they have to be rebaptized? Cyprian said yes, because they were baptized by somebody without apostolic succession. The Bishop of Rome, Stephen, said no, they don't have to be rebaptized because they got baptized in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And they believed in him. That's all that matters. Now again, I think Stephen was right there. Cyprian was wrong. But Cyprian said, well, I'm not listening to you. Stephen said, I'm the Bishop of Rome. I'm more important than the Bishop of Carthage. And in fact, all you North African churches are supposed to fall under my authority. I will excommunicate you if you don't agree with me on this. Cyprian said, you got no authority. All bishops are equal. And so now this big argument's happening. Guess how it got solved? It didn't. The Valerian persecution started and both these men got killed. So I'm pretty sure once they got to heaven, they were like, well, I guess we are, the things we argue about, now we're dead, that argument's over. And so it really didn't get solved. And Novatianism continued up into the 6th and 7th century, so it was a pretty big deal. So yeah, these were big consequences. Big consequences. and you start to see things like, can the Bishop of Rome claim superiority over other bishops? Can he threaten to excommunicate whole regions of the world? At this point, bishops were saying no. 800 years later, that's exactly what the popes are going to be able to do. So you see these ideas starting here. Now, the final persecution. The persecution to end all persecutions is the worst persecution, and it's by an emperor named Diocletian. He takes over in 284, reigns to 305. That's when he quits. He retires. He doesn't die. Late 3rd century, the empire began to go into great decline. So you got 50 more years where the Christians, for the most part, are left alone. They learn the lessons. They realize what happened by being weak. Not being ready for the Decian persecution. So when the Diocletian one comes, they're ready for it, even though it's been another 30 years. Now, Rome was an absolute hot mess. It was falling apart. You have invasions. You have their economy falling apart. And the pagans in Rome, they were blaming, again, the Christians for this. So that's going to lead to the persecution. And then on top of that, you actually have the first kingdom of the world to become a Christian kingdom, Armenia. The Armenian king becomes a Christian and says we're officially a Christian nation. They're just north of Rome in the like Turkey area, the Black Sea area. And so the Rome's like, man, a kingdom became Christian? That's not good. And then we have Christians in our country not worshiping the gods and we're falling apart. So a lot of Romans at this point were starting to get frustrated again. So Diocletian, he was a genius. He reorganizes the empire this way. So he's like, here's how we're going to do it. We're going to split the empire in half. There will be a west half and east half. There's not going to be one emperor. There's going to be four. Okay. On the east and the west, there will be an Augustus. Okay. That's the top dog. But under that Augustus will be a number two, which we'll call a Caesar. Okay. And so what will happen is, for example, maybe on the west side, the Augustus will rule from Rome, but the Caesar will rule from England. And then same thing on the east side and stuff like that. So you'll have four emperors that splits up the administrative task, and then they'll split the empire up into 12 districts called dioceses, which is interesting that the Catholic Church kept that word, but it was actually a Roman political word. And so by dividing it up this way, it actually worked. They solved the economic and structural problems of the Roman Empire, and stability returned. The problem is Diocletian's Caesar. So Diocletian decided he was going to be the Augustus of the East, and Galerian was going to be his Caesar. Galerian hated Christians. Diocletian really didn't have anything against them at first. His wife was a Christian, and his daughter was a Christian. But his number two, I was about to make a joke, but his number two, Galerian, I had to stop myself. His number two, Galerius, he hated Christians, and so he is going to convince Diocletian that Christians need to be wiped out. So in the year 303 began the most terrible of all persecutions. More Christians will die in this one than any of the other ones, okay? And so what happens with this is Diocletian, so first what he does is he dismisses all Christians from the government and the army. Can't work for the government, can't serve in the army, you can't have any professional position. Then he issues 4 edicts between 303 and 304. Burn all Christian buildings and their writings, destroy all the churches, destroy all the Bibles, go specifically after their leaders, the clergy, imprison and execute them, okay, if they don't sacrifice to the gods. Because the third edict is they must sacrifice to the gods or be tortured. And by the way, his wife and his daughter sacrificed to the gods to save their own lives. That's awful. And then finally, the 4th edict, all citizens must sacrifice to the gods or be executed. And a lot of them will be executed. Now, in the east, there were a lot of martyrs, the eastern half of the empire. And in the middle part of the western empire, there was a lot of martyrs. But there's one part that there wasn't. And so let me bring up this map again. On the very western part, okay, of the Roman Empire, the part that has England or Britain, Gaul, and Spain, it was the Caesar there, his name was Constantius. Whose dad do you think he is? Constantius, what does that sound like? Constantine. Constantius was not going to persecute the Christians. He more or less what he did is he burned down a couple buildings, but he wasn't like trying to seek and destroy the Christians. Okay? And so pretty much but in the rest of the empire, the persecutions were awful. And the crazy thing is some of the Christians were very defiant. Like when they were being executed, they were talking back. They were mouthing back to the government. You're the evil ones. You're going to set me on fire? You're going to be in an eternal fire. You think we're the criminals? You're the criminals. I mean, you read some of the accounts, I'm like, man, these guys had some guts, Pretty much they weren't taking it like the ones did in the Decian persecution where they were, denying the faith, whatever. These ones were bold, and they were willing to mouth off before they die in a good way, not like in a dumb way. And they more or less said, this government's evil, not the Christians. You persecutors are the ones who are evil. So the persecution didn't work. And as many Christians as Diocletian killed, more and more people became Christians. Eventually, half the empire identified as Christian, even in the midst of the persecution. So now, if the mobs are helping, they might be killing their own family members. And so Diocletian's like, everything I did was a success except this. And so, due to his shame and his failure, he resigned. And he made the Augustus of the West resign, which now made Constantius the Augustus of the West, and Galerius, the Augustus of the East. Galerius kept going after the Christians. Okay, so the persecution just kept intensifying. And then what's going to happen is Constantius dies. Somebody else becomes the Augustus of the West, but Constantius' son, Constantine, is declared to be the Caesar of the West by the soldiers there. And so pretty much what's going to happen is simply put, Constantine starts to think, we don't need four emperors. He wants to be the sole emperor. So Constantine sneak attacks Maxentius. Maxentius was the Augustus that ruled out of Rome. He had the bigger force, but Constantine's like, you know what? And again, Constantine's not going after the Christians. Maxentius is. Constantine goes and attacks, and he wins. And so there's this battle that decides it all, right outside of Rome, called the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And pretty much Constantine says that the night before the battle, he saw a vision that said, in this sign you will conquer. And the sign was two Greek letters on top of each other. The chi, which looks like an X, and then the rho, which looks like a P, but it's the R. And if you put a rho on top of a chi, it looks like a man on a cross. And that was already an identifiable Christian symbol at that point. And so one of his soldiers told him, that's a Christian symbol you saw. So Constantine said, fine, if I win and I conquer, then I will dedicate myself to Christ, to the Christian God. So Constantine painted that on their shields. They went into battle. They won. His enemy got killed. Now Constantine was the ruler of the western half of the empire. Okay? Now the eastern half was still at first continuing the persecutions. Constantine worked out a deal with the Augustus there, which was called the Edict of Milan. Okay, the Edict of Milan, where they would stop persecuting the Christians. All religions were declared legal at this point. There are no illegal religions. So Constantine didn't make Christianity the sole religion, he just made it legal. Okay? A few years later, the ruler over there, whose name was I know it starts with an L, Licinius, in the year 320, he reneges on the Edict of Milan, which was signed in 313. He reneges on that and he starts persecuting Christians. So Constantine now says, we got to save the Christians that are being killed in the eastern half of the empire. So he invades the east and he wins. And now Constantine is the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, and he declares himself to be a Christian. We'll debate whether or not he was really a Christian. I tend to think he was, but some people think this was all political. But there was really, he gained nothing from this. Like becoming a Christian didn't make him more powerful, meaning there was no political advantage to this, since hardly any of the elites were Christians, hardly anybody in the army were Christians. So he really thought he saw something, right? And he really thought it was in the name of Christ he was supposed to conquer, and he did. And after that, the persecutions stop. And so that's pretty much how we get to then. 325 is when you could say the persecutions are officially over. And so what were the results of the persecution? Let me just blast through this and then we'll be done. One thing that happens is they're going to start to revere the martyrs. They start caring for their remains, their bones, and then they start making catacombs and stuff like that. And eventually they start to think there's miraculous powers in these things, and it's going to lead to the cult of relics. I'll tell you more about what that means in one of the upcoming lessons. And then another consequence of it all was the rule of bishops. Okay, that controversy that happened because of the Decian persecution solidified the fact that the bishops are separate from the presbyters, and the bishops rule the church. And so you have that, bishops, apostolic succession, all that is set in stone, but you get this idea that starts to float around that there's one bishop above them all. And that's eventually going to, and it's the Roman bishop. Eventually that's going to evolve into the papacy. So those are some of the results of persecution. So in conclusion, the church underwent persecution from as early as Acts chapter 4. It was tragic having the powerful state of Rome as well as the local mobs killing millions of believers. And today, 2023, there's still millions of believers around the world being persecuted for Christ. Next time, we'll talk about the other issues that were taking place in the same period of time, and hopefully it won't take me as long to get through it all. So if you could stop the toggle, we'll be good to go.